Romans chapter 11, starting in verse 1. Hear the word of the Lord. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So, too, at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened, as it is written. God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that they would not see, and ears that they would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and bend their backs forever. So I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Now, I am speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order that somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump, and if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but stand in awe. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who are fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? Lest you be wise in your own conceits, I want you to understand this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Just as you were at one time disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of their disobedience, so they too have now been disobedient in order that by the mercy shown to you, they may also now receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he might have mercy on all. Oh, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways! For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Or who has given to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. May the Lord add his blessings to the reading of his holy word. Well, is ethnic pride wrong? I see at least 3 races represented here. Is ethnic pride wrong? Is it wrong to feel some enjoyment or some, what you would call confidence, some value in your ethnic heritage? Now that's kind of a sticky question because first for Christians, they're very uncomfortable with the idea of pride, and for good reason. The Apostle John tells us that the pride of life is not from the Father, but from the world. Pride is one of the things the Lord hates. But the problem is that we often use the word in English, pride, or like I say, I am proud of, to mean I feel good about. I'm not ashamed of. Like, I'm proud of my child's grades, or I'm proud of the way my house looks. And that's not necessarily bad. So is ethnic pride bad? Is it wrong to feel good about your race or nation? Now, that's an interesting question. On Memorial Day weekend, Americans would say yes to celebrating the nation, but Americans have a very uncomfortable time with ethnic pride because we are a nation that's not based on race. In some nations, you can get citizenship just automatically if you share their race. But in the U.S., we are supposed to be united by ideas, by convictions, ideals, rather than by ethnicity. Now, so the motto included on the first American seal, established in 1782, had the words, E Pluribus Unum, Latin for out of many, one. Now, we were one nation created out of people from many other nations. Now, sure, we can allow different ethnic groups, to celebrate their own heritage. We have the Irish Americans celebrate St. Patrick's Day, their heritage, and a lot of people wear green on that day, even if they're not really Irish. Or Italian Americans on Columbus Day, Mexican Americans on Cinco de Mayo. We can establish special times to remember the contributions of certain groups, especially ones that were suppressed in the past, like African Americans. We can still be one, I think most Americans agree, but allow for the many to be proud of their diversity. Of course, some Americans who are in the majority dislike all this, almost any talk about ethnic identity, saying, you should feel proud of your ethnic heritage, forget it all, just be American. Likely, they just don't know what it's like to be a minority, to feel different, with a different culture, different origin. It's easy for people who are in the majority to just assume that their culture is culture. That's just, everyone is that way, they think. That's the way everyone lives and acts, like the way they do. That it's easy to fit in. It's easy for me to fit in. It should be easy for you to fit in, right? It's easy to feel apart. I feel apart. Why shouldn't you feel apart? Now, I lived in Singapore for 5 years, and there I suddenly found myself, raised as a majority, one of the majority, found myself a small minority. And I wanted to be reminded of my nation. I celebrated July 4th and Thanksgiving every time it came around, even though no one around me did. And before the internet, I listened to the Voice of America on shortwave radio. I wanted to hear what's going on in America. I ate at McDonald's and KFC and looked forward every week to what was then my favorite TV show, America's Funniest Home Videos. Now, not only was it funny, but for a half hour a week, I could imagine I was back in America. I craved that. I was proud of my nation. The majority there is Chinese. And like most majorities, anywhere, they just kind of assume their way is the way. I once spoke to a Chinese Singaporean man who was there in Singapore, planning on coming to America. He was talking to me about what it was like. He was just asking me questions. And I told him that, once you're there, you may find a Chinese church that you would feel comfortable in. And he responded, that won't be necessary. I'll feel perfectly comfortable with the Americans. I didn't say anything. Just look at him. You'll feel differently once you get to the U.S. You will suddenly feel like such a stranger, and you'll crave the familiarity of your culture. Even if you, most of the time, even if you eat with forks, you'll want to see some chopsticks. You'll want to hear some Mandarin. You'll want some Chinese food. Familiar ways. You want to be around familiar ways of thinking, of seeing things. You don't realize how Chinese you really are. I knew that because I didn't realize how American I was until I left America. The fact is, almost you can ask, should you have ethnic pride. The fact is, almost everyone is proud of their ethnicity in some way. That's what is home to them. It's what you eat, it's the way you eat it, it's what you value, the way you treat people, the way you see yourself, your family, your country, your history. It's in the air you breathe. It's home. And God stands over all the nations and the cultures and the ethnicities of the world. And he sees perfectly all the strengths, the weaknesses, the sins, the virtues of each one. And out of them all, he is calling one people together. They can all bring in their languages, their forks if they want, their chopsticks if they like. They can leave their shoes at the door if they do that kind of thing, or they can wear them in the house. They can retain a lot about their native culture. But that must not be the center of who they are. At their heart must be a faith in Jesus that attaches them to other people with that same faith from every nation in the world. Well, here in Romans 11, we see Paul deal with that ethnic pride. It's a pride that he was familiar with because he shared it, at least the good part of it, himself. If any group of people have something to feel proud about, it's the Jews. Now, sure, the Americans have their Declaration of Independence, values of liberty and justice for all, power and prosperity, powerful military, prosperous economy. We have the bravery and the sacrifice of our troops that we remember on Memorial Day, something we can rightly feel proud of, that so many people laid down their lives for this country. And the Chinese have their long history. The wisdom of Confucius, the Great Wall, inventions like gunpowder and the compass, paper, printing. But all of that pales into comparison to what Israel could be proud of. They have the fact. God chose them. Of all the people in the world, chose them. God revealed himself to their forefathers. He led them powerfully out of Egypt. He gave them a law. He spoke to them through prophets. He raised up a king, David, to rule for God himself. Now that's something you can feel proud of. They regularly prayed. This is one of their standard devotional daily prayers. Blessed are you, Lord, King of the universe, for not having made me a Gentile. So ethnic pride was a very part of their daily prayers. And with that kind of pride, and our own place as non-Jews in God's people, Paul deals with in this chapter. And he deals with it in three parts. First, the remnant in verses 1 to 10. And then second, the tree in verses 11 to 24. And third, the mystery in verses 25 to 36. Well, first, the remnant. Earlier in Romans, he's shown that being right with God comes through faith. Does it come through works? Does it come through ancestry, just being born into it? He said in Romans chapter 2, verse 28, for no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly. He picked up this idea again. He just kind of dropped that like a bomb in chapter 2. But now he picks it up again in chapter 9, where he said in verse 6, not all who are from Israel are of Israel. Now that should sound very strange, doesn't it? You think about that. That's a very strange thing to say. It would be strange to say, no one is Polish who is merely one outwardly. Huh? Or, not all who are from Japan are of Japan. What? Sure you are. If that's your ethnicity, if that's where you come from, where your parents come from, that's where your ancestors were, then that is who you are. You inherit your ethnicity. In the modern Israeli and modern Israel, they have a law called the right of return. And it states just that in law. Any person from anywhere in the world who has Jewish ancestry, okay, that means either parent, doesn't have to be both parents, mother or father, or even just one grandparent out of your 4 grandparents who is Jewish, is considered Jewish, is considered a Jew, and has a right to immigrate to Israel, become a citizen automatically. You step off the plane, you You can prove that one of your grandparents is a Jew. You are a Jew. You are a citizen of Israel as soon as you're there. That's the modern Israeli law. And it's saying one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly. All who are from Israel are of Israel, the law says. But the inspired Apostle Paul says, no. Being one of God's people, which is the most important meaning of what it means to be of Israel, being one of God's people who inherit the promises given to Abraham, does not depend on being literally born from Abraham. Your physical ethnicity does not make you one of God's people. What matters, he's been hammering on through Romans, is faith. Now, if that's the case, to begin chapter 11, then he asks, has God rejected his people? He answers again emphatically, absolutely not. But let's be careful here. Some people point at that and say, see, then you are of Israel if you are from Israel. Now, let's be careful here to see who are his people that he's not rejected. They aren't just Israelites by birth, but some who are from Israel are of Israel, as Paul shows here with 4 proofs. First, he says, the personal. Me. Look at me. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham. But God has saved me. I am one saved out of this many who will not believe. Second, the theological. In verse 2, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. And that last word should ring a bell. Foreknew? This should immediately remind us of what the last time Paul spoke of God foreknowing, which is in Romans chapter 8, verse 29. For those whom he foreknew, whom he decided beforehand to have a relationship with, those whom he foreknew, those he predestined and called and justified and glorified. They are God's elect, whom no one can condemn. There's therefore no condemnation for those whom God foreknew. It is as good as done. So here, has God rejected every literal Israelite? Has he? No. There's me, Paul says, the personal. Then there's those whom he has foreknown, the elect. Third, there's the biblical. Some think that the Old Testament, they assume the Old Testament is for Israel. It's not for us, it's for Israel, the literal Jews. But even the Old Testament shows us that not all who are from Israel are really of Israel, are really God's people. In Elijah's time, most of Israel was persecuting God's true people. The ethnic people were persecuting the true people, killing the prophets, demolishing God's altars. And Elijah felt so alone at one point, he just cried out, I'm the only one left. But the Lord said that he's kept for himself 7,000 men who are still faithful to him. There are a faithful few, the Bible shows us. Well, fourth, there's the partial. In verse 5, just as in Elijah's day, so too, Paul says, so too, at the present time, there is a remnant, just a few left over. The question is, starting that he begins with, has God rejected his people? No, there is a part, a remnant of Israel who are really his people. They are not rejected, but it's only partial. He's kept a remnant in Israel. He's kept one then, he kept one now, who are his people. And they are chosen, he says, because they're Israelites. All Israelites are God's people? No, they are chosen by grace. Not because they are better than the others, or have something to be proud of, but purely by grace. Grace, he says, that is dependent on something in us people, isn't really grace at all, is it? In order for it to be grace, it has to depend on nothing in us, on God alone. So as God rejected all of Israel, all the Jews, Paul's own ethnic group, that he feels, rightly so proud of, that he has such sympathy for, he has such love for his own people, but they are not contrary to what they think and to what they are wrongly proud of. They are not right with God. simply because they are Israelites. Sure, some of them are saved. Some of them will be saved. But that's not because they are Israelites. It's only because of God's grace to them. So then in verse 7, he's echoing back to his previous question all the way back to chapter 9, verse 30. All the way, he dealt with all the way through chapter 10. Israel was seeking to be right with God. All that law keeping, they were seeking to be right with God, but they didn't get it. Why? Now, sure, with a few, the remnant, the elect, they got it. He says, there was a remnant by grace who got right with God. But he says, but the rest were hardened. The reason the majority of the Israelites did not accept that Jesus was the Messiah was because in verse 8, God gave them a spirit of stupor. That's like when they hear the gospel, it's like they're asleep. They're unable to see it, unable to understand it. You ever try to talk to someone who's asleep? You don't get very far. They said they have eyes that they would not see, ears that they would not hear. And he says, down to this very day. And then condemnation, the sentence against them, that they would be trapped, that they would stumble, that they would be blinded, that they would be enslaved. That's what comes upon those who are from Israel, who are not really of Israel, who wouldn't believe. But there is a remnant. They're out of Israel that God is calling some. Next we see the tree. This is an illustration. A tree, an olive tree, starting in verses 11 to 24. He said that Israel, as most of the Jews, have stumbled at what in chapter 10 he called the word of Christ, the preaching about Jesus, that preaching that being right with God is through believing in Jesus, what he did. And so in verse 11, have they completely fallen? No more to be considered, these Jews. Have they completely fallen? Again, absolutely not. But because they didn't accept Jesus, the word of Christ has gone out to the non-Jews. So God used the sin of Israel. God used their hardening of heart to bring salvation to other ethnic groups, to other nations. You see, for most of the early Christians, like Paul, the apostles, this was a total surprise what happened. You know, they expected the Jews to happily accept the news of the Messiah, that Jesus was the Messiah, that he rose from the dead, that now they should just simply believe him. They probably, what happened on the day of Pentecost when so many, 3,000 believed and came. They probably expected that just to continue and increase everywhere they went. But time after time, even though a few Jews would believe here and there, most rejected the word of Christ. And so they took then the gospel, that word out to the non-Jews, to the Greeks, to the Romans, the Arabs, the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, whoever else was around. Many of them accepted it. And if it had not been for the rejection of the gospel by many of the Jews, they may never have considered actively taking the gospel to the others. Their hands may have been full, for that matter, just discipling and baptizing all these Jewish converts that they expected to come in. They just may never have had the time to go out to the Gentiles. So God used this rough reception, these closed doors they were getting everywhere when they went to the Jews. He used that to get the Christians out of the synagogues and into the marketplace of the Gentiles. He used the rejection by the Jewish officials to steer them out to the world, to the people, like our ancestors, because it was from them, our ancestors, that he was now calling his people. So he says in verse 12, their trespass, that is the sin of the Jews, in rejecting the gospel, their trespass has meant riches for the world. That is for the non-Jewish people. Because that's us, right? We are getting the gospel as a direct result of them rejecting the gospel. So he says, if we, non-Jewish people, if we're getting riches by their failure, how much better will it be for us and for them if one day they stop resisting, if they accept Jesus as the Messiah? if finally the full number of Jews that are supposed to believe, if finally they will believe, it's an exclamation. How much more, how much greater will it be, Paul says, when that day comes. So even though he calls himself here the apostle to the Gentiles, that is, he is selected by the Lord Jesus himself to carry the word of the Christ to non-Jewish people like our ancestors, he still cares for his own people. He is the good kind of ethnic pride. He wants to see his people saved too. So he hopes that if the Jews see non-Jews like us enjoying the blessings of God, getting the benefits of the covenant with God that the Jews thought was just for them, to see us getting the benefits of that, then they will get jealous. They'll say, hey, there's something to this gospel after all. Paul's right. And thus some of them will be saved. So finally, when that happens, finally what he calls the full number, the full complement of them will be included among God's people. Because in verse 15, that is, if their rejection, which I think he means that they have rejected the gospel, if that means that them having rejected the gospel means reconciliation for the world, that is, people of all kinds of different nations, like our ancestors, of out of many ethnic groups, if they're now being put in a good relationship with God because they rejected it, if formerly pagan, non-Jewish, sinful, often barbaric people, especially us Westerners, if we're being reconciled with God, what then will it mean, he says, when the full number of Jews finally accept Jesus as the Messiah? He says that will be a glorious day, like the resurrection, like life from the dead. There is still, he says, a full number of them waiting to be brought in. So for us, that means we should not use their rejection of the gospel as an excuse to reject them, to treat them like animals, discriminate against them, treat them badly, even though only some of them are truly holy, he says, selected by God. It's like a pinch of dough. You're going to make a big offering, they take a pinch of it and give it as a sacrifice of first fruits. But still, if that pinch is the really holy thing that's sacrificed, well, so the whole lump, in a way, has some of that holiness wear off on it. If the root of the tree, Abraham and David, is holy, so are the branches. It doesn't mean, now, that doesn't mean that comparison, well, they're all holy and they're all saved, they're all related, if they're related to holy people, so they're all holy people, that they can go to God, to heaven, their own way, through their own covenant. We heard something about that in Sunday school. No, it means that God will still draw people from them, down to this present day, out of them, and many other ethnic groups. God, different trees for every nation. No, there's one tree representing all of God's people. Now, some of the natural branches, he says, are broken off. Natural branches. That is the branches that thought they deserved to be part of that tree because they were just born into it. It's it's part of their ethnic identity to be part of that tree. They were proud of their attachment to the tree and thought it was theirs just by birthright. But they are cut off, away from the tree. While other cultures, other ethnic groups who were not at all influenced by the Word of God, they're wild, they're uncultivated, they're grafted in to this tree. That is now formerly pagan people from all other kinds of ethnic groups, like your ancestors, our ancestors, like Americans or even Chinese, are being attached to this tree and now are absorbing the nourishment of the sap from this one tree. So out of many nations is being made one lively, united, diverse, but one tree. Now, why were the old branches cut off? The natural ones, called natural. Because God doesn't like Jews anymore? Is that it? Like some anti-Semites, Nazis, people like them want to think? No. That's the arrogance. In fact, he specifically warns us against this kind of arrogance that we should not have. Paul tells us, he warns us in verse 18, don't think that way. Looking down on them as though they are inferior, as though they are just despicable. Don't do that, and don't do that for three reasons. First, consider the root, he says. The root of our faith. That is through Abraham, through David, the rest of the Old Testament. The promises that saved us come through them. And so we are attached to them. Remember, it is one tree, and we can call this tree Israel. And if we're attached to the tree, that means we're part of Israel, doesn't it? Second, remember that we stand by grace, which is the greatest antidote to pride. So remember that. Third, consider God's character. That is, particularly consider his kindness and severity, his gentleness and his sternness. Realize that if God cut off people, his own people, who were raised believing in these covenant promises, raised to think that they belong to God, to keep the law, with what we call the Old Testament, just part of their culture and their upbringing. If he cut them off, think how much more easily he'll cut you off. So he says in verse 20, stand in awe. So why have those old branches been cut off? Because of, he says in verse 20, unbelief. They didn't believe in God because they believed in themselves. And basically, that's what pride is. That's how you can define pride, isn't it? Belief in ourselves. They particularly had an ethnic pride. They didn't understand that they needed grace to stand before God. They didn't understand the God that they were dealing with, that he was both kind and stern, both merciful and severe. People today like to think of only about part of who God is. The kindness, the mercy, the grace, the positive and the encouraging. And so they stay arrogant, trusting in their own morality or their own religion or their own ethnic heritage, or just the fact that they're, on average, they're about decent. Not too much worse than your average person. Perhaps one of the favorite quotations of Jesus today, after maybe second to judge not, is he who is without sin cast the first stone. Which they love the kindness of that. The kindness. Often because they think that means they can continue in sin. These other people don't get to criticize me. Jesus he's taking my back. He's covering for me. The kindness, but also the severity. He's severe toward those who reject him, who don't believe him, who arrogantly assume that they have God taken care of because they aren't so bad, that they belong to the olive tree by nature, that they belong to a Christian nation or to a Christian family. They won't consider the severity of God, and so they won't stand in awe of him. They'll just take him for granted. And in such a case, they are liable to be cut off by him. It is faith that attaches us to that one tree. If we lose it, we presume on our membership in the people of God, it's just ours, we will be cut off. And if Israel will but stop unbelieving, well, then they will be grafted in again. All they have to do is believe, and it would be easier for them to do so, because their whole culture is shaped by the Word of God, by the laws and the prophets and the Proverbs, and so they are the natural branches. All God has to do is soften their hearts, open their eyes, wake them up from this spiritual stupor, and they will believe. It is easier for them to do so than it is for us. Our barbaric culture, gladiatorial games, leaving infant children out to die if we think there's something wrong with them, or just the fact we're so hostile and aggressive, or just greedy and materialistic, individualistic. Or maybe we're thinking that family really is everything. There is one tree into which branches are off of which either branches are cut off or maybe into which they are grafted in. If the branches get proud and they think they have a right to be part of the tree, well, then the severe God breaks them off. And then the kind God takes other branches, wild, uncultivated, who know they have no right to be part of that tree, and he'll connect them to it. From God's side, nothing makes him do it. He does it by grace. From our side, what attaches us is faith. So, there's a remnant, a chosen people within all the natural peoples of the world, chosen by grace. There's a tree, one tree made up of many branches from other trees. And finally, there is a mystery. Now, this wasn't what I've been describing. This absolutely wasn't what Israel had expected. Israel expected that a Messiah would come who would lead them in triumph over all their earthly enemies. They expected a God who was on their side, on their army's side, who would give them victory and prosperity. Give it to them, Israelites, simply because it was theirs by right, inherited by birth, by ethnicity. And so they prayed, "Blessed be you for not making me a Gentile like the rest of those dogs." They weren't expecting to be told that they had to believe it to be one of God's people, that God has a people made out of many other peoples into which he is making them into one. That was the mystery. It was hidden under the surface in the Old Testament. Now it's hinted at here and there, like in Psalm 117 we read earlier. Praise the Lord, all nations. Extol him, all peoples. It's a mystery, now fully revealed, out in the open in the New Testament. But they weren't expecting it. They certainly weren't expecting that they would be cut off. And the same thing could happen to us if we get conceited. If we allow our ethnic pride, maybe our faith in our own works and our own morality, our own religion to delude us into thinking we've got God taken care of, that he must be on our side. After all, besides e pluribus unum, we also put in our money in God we trust. And surely God appreciates that we do that for him, doesn't he? Even though if in fact we really trust in our money. We can get conceited if we forget the mystery. Now understand the mystery. Okay? Starting from verse 25 to the end of the chapter, a partial hardening has come upon Israel. It's partial because still, from the beginning of the gospel until now, some Jews are being saved. Okay? It's not an entire hardening. Still, some are being saved, but not many. A partial hardening, he says then, is until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Now that word until, it may imply that a full number of non-Jewish people will come into the people of God. And when that number is complete, that God has in his mind how many he is going to reap from the world. And when he reaches that number, gets that to that quota, when they are saved, they are made part of the olive tree, then Israel will no more be hardened. And then there will be a great revival among the Jews, and many of them will accept Jesus as the Messiah. That's not clearly stated, but we can hope so. What it does clearly say is that now Israel is partially hardened while the Lord is bringing in people from all other kinds of ethnic groups. The Lord is right now, was in Paul's day, it still is now, reaching that full number of people from every other nation. From the beginning of the church, the gospel has been spreading, actually been spreading mostly west. You think of history, not evenly, but nation by nation. Sometimes resisted by some nations, but then sometimes the Lord does something on a national scale, sovereignly, and turns the hearts of a whole nation to himself for a time. First, the gospel spread southwest to Ethiopia, then spread to what's what we now call Turkey, to Greece, to Rome, through the Roman Empire, into Europe. And through Europe, it eventually spread with the Europeans west to America. And now it is spreading both, still going west across the Pacific and south to other places of the world. While it appears perhaps now not only spreading, but sometimes the hardening spreads too in different places, that Europe has been hardened, at least parts of it, maybe large parts of it. Europe has been hardened and may perhaps cut off, having become presumptuous and proud, thinking that they are civilization. We're Europeans, we're civilized. Now, Europe has some of the highest percentages of belief in atheism, especially in the east and the north. Eastern and Northern Europe are some of the most atheistic parts of the world today. But let us Americans not then become proud. We have something that they don't. The same thing could happen here. Indeed, it may have already begun. The part of the country that used to be the first Bible Belt, New England, settled by fiery Puritans, come to America to worship God according to His Word. That part of the country, New England, is now the least Christian part of the U.S. Only 3% of New Englanders go into an evangelical church. Only 3% profess Jesus to be their personal Lord and Savior. Only 3%. That's about the same level as those hard places in Europe. Now that could spread here to the south too. The Lord hardens and cuts off some nations, while He also softens and He adds other nations. The gospel has grown enormously in South Korea and China. In 1800, there were no known Protestant Christians in all of China. Now there are an estimated 40 million. Some estimated that it's as high as 100 million. The first Protestant church wasn't planted in Korea until the year 1884. But within 100 years, there were about 30,000 churches, not 30,000 believers, 30,000 churches in South Korea. Some of them, some of the largest churches in the world. With there now being, today, there are now more Christians in Korea than there are believers in Buddhism or in traditional religion in Korea. In other words, in Korea now, Christianity is the largest religion in just a little over 100 years. That's amazing. Meanwhile, the gospel has also spread wildly in Africa. In the year 1900, there were only 9 million Christians in the whole continent of Africa. But 100 years later, year 2000, there were an estimated 380 million. It may be that before Jesus returns, that every nation on the face of the earth, every ethnic group, will have its time of being softened and grafted into the tree as the Lord reaps believers from among them. The mystery, hidden in the past, but revealed now, out in the open now, is that Israel is hardened. The fullness, that's the full number, the number that God has set in His mind that He is going to take from the world, the full complement of believers from all kinds of ethnic groups, is now coming in. And in verse 26 says, and this is important, look at that verse 26. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. Now notice that key conjunction, okay, the connecting words there that explain the relationship of ideas, explain what comes before it. Here, notice the word in this way. Verse 26. Now some assume that means then all Israel will be saved. Israel's hardened, full number of Gentiles come in, then after that's done, all Israel, all the Jews, they think, will be saved. That it's about time, it's about sequence. That it means first Israel hardened, and then this all ethnic Israel being finally converted. But really that's not what it says. The word there is very particular, and it's specific. It means so, properly translated here in the ESV, in this way, or thus. That is, through this full number of these Gentiles coming in from all kinds of other nations, ethnic groups, being saved. In this manner, like this, all Israel will be saved. And that tells us what all Israel there means in verse 26. All Israel, then, okay, if all Israel, verse 25, There's a remnant in Israel, but most of it's hardened. It's just partial. And there's a full number from the Gentiles coming in to this one tree. And like this, in this way, all Israel is saved. So all Israel, therefore, is the remnant from literal Israel, the Jews, combined with the believers from every nation that he is drawing in. That's all Israel. In this way, God is adding to his one people, which we can call, you can call it Israel, you can call it the church. It's symbolized by the one tree. The remnant, let me say it again, because this is different from what many of you may have been raised to think. The remnant in ethnic Israel, these people, plus believers from every nation, in this way, come out of the world to form one people of God. E Pluribus Unum. So, the deliverer, Christ, because of his work in Zion, will create one holy people, banishing ungodliness, making a covenant with them, taking away their sins. So even though the Jews are now hardened, at least partially, while God gathers believers from other nations, the Jews are still beloved. God is still saving some from the Jews today, but we may be tempted to scoff and to think, well, they're just being disobedient to the gospel. They refuse to believe. But so were we at one time, and we received mercy. The kind God softened us and grafted us in to his people. He's going around the world, this kind God is, to every nation, bringing them in. Because in verse 32, God has charged, it says all. What's it mean? All who? All, every individual? Well, it means all, meaning every ethnic group. He's charged every nation with disobedience so that he might have mercy on everyone. Every individual? No. Every ethnic group. Every nation. By finding a remnant in everyone, saving believers out of everyone. That's the mystery. They didn't expect that. They expected, like a lot of us, that God in history is all about us, if not individually, at least nationally. Like our ethnic pride. It's about our ethnic group. But God's plan is much bigger than any one nation or culture or race. It's about his grace, and his glory. The mystery, along with the severity and the mercy, he says, should make us stand in awe. And that's what he does at the end of chapter 11. Himself awed by what God has done. Oh! The exclamation at the end of at the beginning of verse 32. The depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God. Oh, who would have thought to make one people out of many, united by one faith, that God could do something so much greater than just exalting one nation. He says, how unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways. You know, you think about it, a God with a small g, probably, who's just for our nation, an American God, maybe a Chinese God, Singaporean God, just for us, who's bound to protect us. It's our little pet. Is bound to prosper us and people like us. A religion that is always in favor of our armies and our emperors and presidents. That's really not remarkable at all. There's nothing astounding about that. But a God who seeks out by grace people from every nation who have nothing else in common except faith in Jesus, and that he draws the hearts of people from every culture to him. That's unthinkable. Who would have imagined such a thing? So he says, who has known the mind of the Lord? Who of us would have thought of a plan like that? The reason each of us here who is truly saved, any of us is truly saved, has a relationship with God, is because of this mystery. That God did not confine his mercy to one ethnic group. That he planned this from the beginning. Remember, he told Abraham, I will make you a blessing to not just his own children, his own descendants, to the nations. That through Christ, he would attach people of all kinds to himself. Well, we've now reached the end of this long journey that we began in Romans chapter 1, from the depths